Everybody, it's a hot one here in Charlotte, North Carolina, but I'm so excited for today's video. I am at the Voices from the Past event, which is something I have wanted to do for several years and I've never managed to make it. It's an event that they do twice a year where they have people at different tombstones around the cemetery who are reenacting or telling the story of who is buried there. I think it's so cool. I've already seen the list of people that are being reenacted, and I know some of these stories. I think I've even shared some of them on this channel maybe. But some of them I've never even heard of. So I'm really excited to go learn and see the costumes and hear the stories and share them all with you. Let's go check this out. The event takes place in the Elmwood Cemetery, and also there's a shuttle over to the Old Settler Cemetery, which is just a couple miles away. I've been to both cemeteries many times before on this channel, so you might recognize where we are. I hope you enjoy checking out these stories with me.
My name is Mary Graham. We're so happy to have you here, and my daughter is, my eldest daughter is Sarah. And I know. And we are here at my final resting place, which is right back there in the middle. Mm-hmm. And we're here to talk about my family, our family, and our special day, which was May 20th, 1775.
So could you tell me about your journey to North Carolina and father?
Sure. But honestly, honey, we've talked about this so many times. All right, one more time. Do you remember when I was born?
Yes, 1730 in the British colony called Pennsylvania.
That is correct. And then I married when I was a young woman, I married Mr. Barber. Sadly, Mr. Barber passed away, but before that we had a daughter, and your half-sister, her name is Esther. And once Mr. Barber passed away, then
You married father.
I did. I married James Graham. Now, James had 6 children prior to marrying me, and then we had 5 children on our own. We had 3 sons, John, George, and Joseph, and we also had 2 daughters, Sarah and her sister Anne. We were very blessed. We traveled, then after my husband passed away, we traveled down the old wagon road
with 12 children.
Wow.
By herself.
Yes. She's my advocate. Which was unusual at that time. Women didn't usually go that far from home, but we moved from Pennsylvania to South Carolina.
As a widow with her cousins.
Yes. We stayed in South Carolina a few years and then decided to move up here to Charlottetown. In 1770, I purchased 200 acres on Paw Creek, which is now near Beatty's Ford Road. And I had meager means, but even when all that we had our property, we had our home, and I was able to send my sons to the best school in the area, which was Queens Museum, and it's later known as Liberty Hall. So we traveled, we became a part of a church community, the Sugar Creek Presbyterian Church community, and all of my children loved to learn.
So we know what happened after we moved, but I think our visitors would like to hear about my brothers and sister and that one special day.
All right. So my sons, John and George and Joseph, distinguished themselves in the Revolutionary War as well as the War of 1812. And they rose to the ranks of Major General and General. As a matter of fact, George is buried right there, right near me. My son John became a doctor. My daughter married Robert Allison, and then we have our other sister, who married Thomas Barnett, and she became. They had several children as well, and her husband Thomas fought in the Revolutionary War along with my son Joseph, and was in his company right here in Charlotte.
Do we have any relation to General Stonewall Jackson?
Absolutely, we do. So my son Joseph's granddaughter married Stonewall Jackson. Her name was Mary Anna Morrison, and she lived real close by here in Charlotte until the day she died. Once Stonewall Jackson passed away, she became affectionately known as the Widow of the Confederacy. And we also, her dad was the very first president of Davidson College, right up the road from here. And and her uncle and my great-great-grandson, William Graham, became a governor of North Carolina.
And we have Graham Street, and it's just only a few blocks away from here.
Yeah. And it goes past something, I think they call it Bank of America Stadium.
I don't know what it's well, our family history is very rich.
It is indeed. So should we talk about that special day thing that happened today?
Would you guys like to hear about our special day?
Of course.
All right. Well, we were so blessed to have our whole family there listening to Colonel Thomas Polk read the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. Because in it, he proclaimed our desire to be free from the British Crown. It was something that would change the history of Mecklenburg County. Our lives would never be the same.
And he was furious at King George for sending soldiers to Lexington and Concord and killing several colonies. And it seemed as if everyone was committed to independence. And the courthouse got so excited they yelled huzzah, and all the men threw their hats into the air. And I even saw somebody on the roof of the courthouse. You could actually listen to the declaration right over there.
Yes, Colonel Polk will be reciting it right over there. But we also know that if the 13 British colonies also proclaimed their independence, then we would be able to govern ourselves as an America. And wanted to thank you so much for coming.
Born in 1750 in Augusta County, Virginia. Basically in those days, probably like today, it was wilderness. Mountainous, beautiful area. It did support the family. My father's name was Charles. I had two brothers. I was 10 years old and I came home from hunting one day. My children and stuff. Helped put food on the table. Come home from hunting and find both my parents had been killed by Indians. They carried my two younger brothers off. The local men went after them, but weren't able to overtake them. They did find the body of my youngest brother. I guess he was too small for them to worry about. So at least he was returned and committed to the earth. Some years later, I heard that my brother Charlie had been traded for some Indian children. I never saw him again, but I did hear that he had been found and released. I don't know whatever became of him. I remember the incident. I had a dream. My mother came to me and told me to take up my bedclothes and go sleep with the cows. So I tried to always listen to mother. So out in the pasture I was. The Indians came back that night. They burned our cabin to the ground. That point I was homeless. Because she had warned me, at least I survived. In 1767, I married Catherine Bradshaw McDonald. 17 years old, she 15. She bore several of our children before we came to Charlotte in 1774. Again, Augusta County, Virginia is a wilderness area, so we thought it's safer to raise our family to come to Mecklenburg County. So we moved to Mecklenburg County. Big difference between Virginia and North Carolina. We loved it here ever since we got here. We bought a farm, began raising livestock, farming. 1774, I actually witnessed the signing of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. I wasn't a signer, but I did witness the men do it. And some years later, the British were making trouble in South Carolina, so a call for volunteers went out. And that's the way service was at that point. The community asked for volunteers. So I volunteered as a private under Colonel Thomas Polk. I served for 3 months. And then returned to Charlotte, volunteered in Captain Brownfield's company. Was appointed a lieutenant. We marched from here to Cross Creek to escort prisoners to Hillsborough. And that was for 2 months. returned to Charlotte, and I volunteered again, this time under Captain Mebane was his name. I served with him for 3 months, returned to Charlotte and volunteered under Captain Jack. We marched to the headwaters of the Catawba River, and I was appointed an Indian spy. We served in that capacity for 6 months. Returned to Charlotte, 1881, volunteered once again. This time I raised a company, was appointed captain. Marched to South Carolina, and we were attached to Colonel William Polk Regiment. From there we had service along the Combahee River. South Carolina in the summertime is not a very nice place to be. There's snakes, there's mosquitoes, there's swamps, it's just hot. And, it was rough service. We saw action around Orangeburg at the Battle of Fort Mott. We also saw action at the Battle of Strawberry, which was outside of Montgomery. After serving about 9 months, I was paroled by the Continental Army and returned to Charlotte. The war ended about a year later. I did not have to volunteer after that. We returned to Charlotte again. Catherine bore 4 of our children after the war. I don't know if I told you their names. There was James and John. I had 5 boys and 3 girls. There were James and John, Samuel, Taylor, and Charles were the 5 boys. And then the 3 girls were Mary Jane, Polly, and Catherine. We called Catherine Ian. Mary Jane some years later married. I think she ended up with 5 children. This is my final rescue.
Thank you.
Unlike a lot, I was kind of a nobody. But here I am. we were members of the Chagall Creek Baptist Presbyterian Church. I have many ancestors that are buried there also.
Thank
My
you.
wife, she is in Chagall Creek. That's where she's buried.
She died after.
Yes.
So you were here by yourself?
I'm here by myself, yes. There is another Hutchins here, but he was the infant son of a Cirrus Hutchins. No relation.
Thank you so much for coming out today. I am Thomas Polk, regarded as one of the 3 founders of Charlotte. I, being a land surveyor of a humble origin, my great-grandfather was Robert Bruce Polk, which of course probably provides you with a hint of our Scottish ancestry. Immigrated from Ulster to Maryland, where he established roots. Of course, being the industrious Scotch-Irishman that he was, established himself prominently in Maryland, and then through the 2nd generation continued to accumulate wealth. And then my parents migrated on to Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, where I and my other siblings were born. I and my brother migrated south here into what was known as Anson County in North Carolina. A huge province in its own right. A vast territory, a vast wilderness. Explored, yes. Settled very sparsely. Then I, with other settlers who took the wagon road south, had established our own homes. We married, had children, and of course, being the land surveyor that I was, had surveyed the hilltop that came to be known as Charlotte. I and the 3 land speculators acquired 360 acres of that land, part of which you are standing on at this moment. I had laid out the town lots, and then of course, being a member of the Colonial Assembly, had established the bill, had sponsored the bill to establish Mecklenburg County in the year 1762. And then, of course, in the year 1767, had helped to sponsor the bill that established Charlotte. Now, we continued to work during that time to establish ourselves. Of course, we helped Governor Tryon during the regulator movement, early 1770s, a peasant rebellion, farmers, disorganized rabble, helped to put that down. Many were surprised that I would take that position, but it was politically expedient to do so at that time. Now, of course, during the 1770s, we were quite aware of what was taking place throughout the colonies, and of course, what was taking place in Massachusetts. Just because we were far and far away from the coast didn't mean that we were ignorant of these affairs. It simply meant that we wanted to be left alone from these affairs until it was something that threatened our own means of existence and our own lives and well-being. And of course, the events that took place in Massachusetts, closure of the port of Boston in 74, that became a rallying point for the colonies and the committees of correspondence, and later the committees of safety that were established, to rally together and to begin to find ways that we could organize and to provide aid and support to our brethren in Boston. And in the early spring of 75, here in Mecklenburg County, our own committees began to meet and to discuss what was to be done to provide support for our brethren. And then it was resolved that at our next meeting in May, the 19th, that representatives, 2 representatives from the county's 9 militia districts would meet at the courthouse in Charlottetown and discuss ways to provide support. I will never forget that day, 19th of May. We were all gathered in the courthouse, discussing, deliberating, finding ways of finding compromise, and without tipping the bucket one way or the other. This was still a radical idea of going against Parliament and the Crown. It was practically a suicidal venture that could have been taken. The world's most powerful army. Then, an express rider from Salisbury had arrived with news that blood had been spilt on the green at Lexington and at Concord in Massachusetts. In fact, that very event took place 250 years ago, this day, in Lexington. Of course, this was a month after the fact. It gives you some perspective of how fast news traveled back in the colonial era. We didn't have your instant messenger of the day that you have today. Well, with that news, the conversation shifted from what should we do to aid our brethren in Boston to one of what should we do here in the county of Mecklenburg to make it perfectly clear that the inhabitants and the residents of Charlottetown and Mecklenburg County were not going to stand any longer for this tyrannical and abusive treatment on the hands of the British Army, for that matter, the policies of the British Parliament, or the North Carolina Assembly. It was determined on that day, in consideration of declaring our independence altogether from the mother country. It's an insane proposition. gradually, over a period of time, the voices of discontent ceased. They ceased. And the voices of freedom rang out. It was determined that a statement to that effect should be framed, should be made. And that committee of 3 men from that delegation included my son-in-law, Reverend Doctor. Yes. Our wonderful, wonderful son-in-law.
Married to our daughter Martha, one of our 3 girls.
Yes. Yes. Dr. Ephraim Bavard. And then, of course, William Kennan, being a brilliant orator that he was. And a third man who's Thomas Frohoff. Came together at Liberty Hall.
His memory's not what it once was.
Over 250 years, it does get a little bit hazy. So, bear with me. Met at Liberty Hall. And they drafted what came to be known as the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. On noon, the 20th of May, is when I read the Declaration from the steps of the courthouse. And in fact, on the 20th of May this year, 2025, I will be reading it again at Trade and Triumph. Would you all like to hear a reading of the Mecklenburg Declaration? Very well. Resolved that whosoever directly or indirectly abetted or in any way, form, or manner countenance the uncharted and dangerous invasion of our rights as claimed by Great Britain is an enemy to this county, to America, and to the inherent and inalienable rights of man. Huzzah! Huzzah! Resolve that we, the citizens of Mecklenburg County, do hereby dissolve the political bands which have connected us to the mother country, and hereby absolve ourselves from all allegiance to the British Crown, and abjure all political connection, contract, or association with that nation, who have wantonly trampled on our rights and liberties, and inhumanely shed the innocent blood of American patriots at Lexington. Huzzah! Huzzah! Resolve that we do hereby declare ourselves a free and independent people, are and of right ought to be a sovereign and self-governing association under the control of no power other than that of our God and the General Congress, to the maintenance of which independence we solemnly pledge to each other our mutual cooperation, our lives, our fortunes, and our most sacred honor. Huzzah! Huzzah! Resolved that as we acknowledge the existence and control of no law or legal officer, civil or military, within this county, we do hereby ordain and adopt as a rule of life all, each and every of our former laws, where nevertheless the Crown of Great Britain never can be considered as holding rights, privileges, immunities, or authority therein. Resolved! Huzzah! Huzzah! Resolved that it is also further decreed that all, each and every military officer in this county is hereby reinstated to his former command and authority, he acting conformably to these regulations, and that every member present of this delegation shall henceforth be a civil officer, a justice of the peace, in the character of a committee man, to issue, process, hear, and determine all matters of controversy according to said adopted laws, and to preserve peace and union and harmony in said county, and to use every exertion to spread the love of country and fire of freedom throughout America until a more general and organized government be established in this province. 3 cheers for freedom and liberty. Hip hip huzzah! Hip hip huzzah! Hip hip huzzah! And that, my friends, is how it was done.
Good job.
Now, of course, after that, it was a mighty declaration of intent. And everyone on that day was filled with this spirit of intent. Having the sense to do so. Well, that December in South Carolina is when we had our little taste of war. It wasn't against the British Army per se, but it was against the Loyalists in the back country. Those who failed to sign the association pledge of South Carolina to remain loyal to the rebel government of that time. There was a large contingent of us that went to South Carolina to fight against the Tories. At 96, we managed to suppress the Tories, but my son William was injured during the snow campaign. He had a lead ball shot through his shoulder. He was brought back here to Charlotte. It's where our future son-in-law, Dr. Ephraim Brevard, had become quite acquainted with our wonderful daughter Martha. They took a liking to one another and married. Soon thereafter, they had a daughter of their own. And for a time, Ephraim continued in his services here. It was a good time to have him. But when the war did come in full force with the British invasion, which they took on the 12th of May, 1780, Charlestown, is when his services as a surgeon was needed. On that day, the 12th of May, following a month-long siege, Sir Henry Clinton and his second, Lord Cornwallis, managed to capture Charlottetown. Over 5,500 Continental soldiers and militia forces, many of them from here in North Carolina, have been captured. It was the worst loss in the war up to that point. Many of those men were sent to the prison ships stationed in Charlestown Harbor. And that was the equivalent of a death sentence because of the prison fever. Doctors and nurses were sent and allowed to tend to the sick and dying aboard those prison ships. And Ephraim volunteered his services as a doctor. Eventually, he too got very, very ill. And as British captors knew that he had little time, they allowed him to be secured from his duties. And Ephraim walked from Charlestown back here to Charlotte.
What he did not know is that in his absence, our dear Martha had already passed.
Very, very difficult time for our family. Martha had died of sickness as well. When Ephraim returned, I didn't recognize him. He was in a very serious state of health. He managed to spend the time writing his last will, testament. And he asked us to raise his daughter, our granddaughter. And he died. Sadly, where he was buried has been lost to time. But we have a memorial to him in front of the cemetery. After that time, it was very difficult for me. I served in the Continental Line as a colonel. I served alongside General Washington at Brandywine in Germantown. I was at Valley Forge. In fact, my regiment, the 4th North Carolina Regiment, was responsible for helping to secure what you refer to as the Liberty Bell from being captured. But it was also a time when men were deserting the army. And that was the case with the 4th North Carolina Regiment. I had come back to North Carolina with the hopes that I could recruit more men. But in my absence, I learned that my regiment had been folded into the 2nd North Carolina Regiment. I was passed over from being promoted to a general. And I felt it necessary to come back to tend to affairs here in Charlotte during the remainder of the war. So we were here, of course, when Cornwallis, on the 26th of September, had invaded Charlottetown. Despite the valiant resistance that was put up by our 250 militiamen against a staggering army under Cornwallis, we had lost the town. But it was not for long in which there would be a major engagement that would take place 40 miles to the west, a place in South Carolina called Kings Mountain. And it was there where a major engagement took place between the South Carolina Loyalists and the Whigs, Scotch-Irish, from what is today East Tennessee, the Over Mountain settlements, in Virginia, and North Carolina, and yes, some from South Carolina, had fought on the 7th of October, 1780. And on that day, the left wing of his lordship's army had been wiped out. And the commander of the Loyalists, of course, being Patrick Ferguson, quite the scoundrel that he was killed in that engagement. Initially, his lordship did not receive that news because while his lordship was here in Charlottetown, we were taking every opportunity to harass the British at every turn. And that included, of course, harassing the foraging parties, going into the countryside and pilfering all of the farms and plantations, because you have to feed and provision an army. Well, during that time of their occupation, there was one such engagement that took place about 7 miles north on Beatty's Ford at John McIntyre's farm. On that day, it was observed that this large foraging party was lumbering slowly out of Charlotte and advancing on Beatty's Ford. All the neighbors were alerted to this, including the first neighbor, who was John McIntyre. And the local militia was called out. When they arrived at McIntyre's farm, they hid in the woods in preparation for this foraging party. When the foraging party arrived, they began to do what the British typically do: pilfer and pillage. And then, as it happened, there were a couple of soldiers that had with them a couple of dogs that were leashed. Somehow the dogs got loose from their handlers and began to run. And the handlers began to chase the dogs. And in that melee, one of those soldiers knocked over a beehive scalp. And of course, that caused quite the distraction, as the other men were ridiculing and laughing the men who were getting stung by the bees. Our boys that were hid out in the woods, in sequence, in unison, prime loaded and fired their muskets on that party, which alarmed them. And of course, they got back on the road to Beatty's and they headed back to Charlotte. It became known as the Battle of the Bees, or the Battle of McIntyre's Farm. It was 2 days after the Battle of King's Mountain, in which his lordship Cornwallis had learned about the defeat at King's Mountain. And that is when he decided that he too should, because of his bad reception, that he was not welcomed as a liberator into Charlottetown, should perhaps reconsider advancing further into North Carolina and retreating back into South Carolina and to Windsor. Such a time. Those were the most memorable times.
Sign of God's providence.
Definitely a sign of God's providence. And this is also a sign of God's providence for me.
Are you sure it wasn't because of who my father was?
Thomas Spratt,
Perhaps.
a very good, industrious father-in-law. A very good marriage.
For us both, I think.
8 children. 5 boys, 3 girls of our own.
I guess we got along okay.
And then there were the others that we took in. Of course,
Unhappy circumstances. But good family.
well, after the war, of course, we received our independence as we had desired since 75. And it was a time of establishing a new republic. Of course, General Washington came back into the fold and serving in public life as our first president of the United States. And during President Washington's second term as president, he took a tour of the new republic. And he saved the last leg of that tour for the best. That, of course, was the Southern tour. She came south, first into North Carolina, out of Virginia, then south into South Carolina, to Charlestown, over to Augusta, over to Camden, and then north from Camden here to Charlotte, in which we entertained him that evening that he came to Charlotte.
A grand reception.
A very grand reception. You are the most wonderful.
But yet, what did he say about us after he left? He called us, what was that word?
A trifling place. Apparently, he was not impressed with Charlottetown. Perhaps it was because he had left his box of wig powder behind and nobody bothered to return it to him. So what questions do you have for me or my wife?
What box did he leave behind?
A box of wig powder. Yes. Powdered wigs.
You know how those men loved their powder.
They have black powder, white powder, black powder being a little bit more explosive than the white powder.
The white powder was only explosive for President Washington's temper.
Without a doubt. Yes. Questions for me, madam? No?
I do believe they have stood here long enough, my dear Thomas.
Oh, yes. I do.
They may want to
appreciate-
adjourn to another location.
Yes. I guess I have spent too much time visiting
He's
Southern Ireland in the afterlife. For I've been told that I've kissed the Blarney Stone many, many times. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Glad you're here today. My name is Harriet Davidson Caldwell. Now, my name may not be quite as familiar to you as that of my father, North Carolina State Senator William Davidson. You may recognize the Davidson name. I was born in 1806 in an area called the Grove in what is now known as Huntersville. Now, my father and my mother especially were very active citizens here in Charlotte. My mother was a lady by the name of Sarah Frew. She had originally married Senator Davidson's nephew, Thomas, but when Thomas passed away, she married a few years later, Senator Davidson. My mother was a very financially savvy. She actually established what we would now call a prenup, making sure that any money and property she had gained herself would pass on to her and not have to be given to her husband, as was the custom at that time. Now, my mother had quite a bit of money for a lady of 21 whose occupation was listed as seamstress. In fact, she had given a business loan to Isaac Cook, the gentleman that owned Cook's Tavern, where President Washington stayed on his tour here in Charlotte. But as I mentioned, I myself was born in 1806, and in 1826, I married a man by the name of Dr. David Thomas Caldwell. My husband and I actually established residence at a fine home just a few miles north of the center of Charlottetown on what is now known as Tryon Street, although at that time it was known as the old Salisbury Highway. That home had been built in 1815 by my husband, by my uncle, Archibald Frew. Now, Archibald Frew at that time had been Charlotte's postmaster and tax collector, which means sadly Uncle Archibald was not a very popular man here in Charlotte. At a time when most of the homes in this area were very small, Uncle Archibald made a point to build an enormous showplace of a house on the main entrance into Charlotte to ensure that would be the first thing that people saw when they came through town. Now, the method of tax collecting in that day was that you were given a quota of money by the government to collect and turn in. If you collected more than the tax quota, you got to keep it. That's how tax collectors made their money. If you collected less, however, it was up to you to make up the difference out of your own pocket. And in 1816, Charlotte experienced what was known as the year without a summer. Crops failed, people could not afford to pay their taxes, and so Uncle Archibald could not pay the tax quota, and he did go bankrupt. Now, fortunately, my father stepped in, sent agents to the auction to purchase the fine home that Uncle Archibald had built, although it was my mother's money that went to buy it. and allowed Uncle Archibald and the family to continue living there. They did not live there for much longer. Uncle Archibald passed away under mysterious circumstances in 1823. It's speculated he may have taken his own life due to his financial circumstances, but we do not know that for certain. What we do know, however, is that he died on April 15th, which I understand is a very important day in terms of taxes. It seems ironic. Now again, a few years later, in 1833, my husband, Dr. Caldwell, and I established ownership of Rosedale, although again, it was my money, left to me by my mother, that used to purchase the home from my father. My husband, Dr. Caldwell, was actually a very prominent physician here in Charlotte. He treated many of the citizens here. He was a traveling doctor and would make house calls as needed, but he also had an office here in uptown Charlotte, not far from the intersection of Trade and Tryon. And he was especially busy when, in 1845, an epidemic of a terrible disease called erysipelas struck the city. My husband was busy treating patients of it, and it killed a quarter of Mecklenburg County's population at one time. He himself did not die from it. I and 3 of my children caught it, and all 4 of us died within a year of each other. Before I passed away, however, I wanted to make certain that my young girls especially were well cared for, and had sent to my home, The Grove, for a lady enslaved by our family, who had taken care of me as a young girl when my mother died when I was only 9, an enslaved lady named Sherry. And Sherry came and took very good care of my daughters, raising them up to be fine young women. Now, my husband remarried a few years later to a lady named Adeline Hutchison from Rock Hill, South Carolina. And when he himself passed away in 1861, the eve of the Civil War, she took their belongings and the rest of the family and moved back to her family home in Rock Hill. Our home stood empty for many years, as far as we are aware. But following the war, my youngest son, Baxter, who had fought in the war, returned home and purchased the home from the rest of the family. He himself lived there for many years until 1919, and during that time brought in his nephew, who would have been my grandson, a young man by the name of Craig Davidson. Craig Davidson came, took ownership of the home when Baxter passed away, and he himself, in 1914, married a lady named Clara Louise Hagee Davidson. They, in turn, had 2 daughters, Mary Louise and Alice, who lived at this home until 1986, when they sold it to a historic foundation, and it was converted into a house museum that still stands today. You may know my fine home now as Historic Rosedale, and it's located just 2 miles up on North Tryon Street, and you can visit it even today. So please come and see my beautiful home up on Rosedale. If you would like more information, feel free to visit the tent down there, and they'll be glad to tell you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, guys, the event is about over and my phone battery is about to die. I only hit, I think, about half of the number of stories that were being reenacted and told today, which is a bummer. I had a challenge for myself to hit them all. But it did warn me on the website when I bought my ticket that there's probably no way you would be able to get to every single tombstone and hear every single story. But I definitely got to the ones I absolutely could not miss. I did not want to miss Thomas Polk, and I didn't want to miss the 3 women who were in such beautiful dresses. I really loved hearing their stories. So I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did. These are some of my favorites, not only to go to these events, but also to film and learn and share. So I'll see you guys another day in another adventure. Bye, guys.